Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Continuing our kind of summer tales, I'm going to read from Luke chapter 14 and verse 27. If you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. But don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everyone would laugh at you. They would say, there's the person that started the building and couldn't afford to finish it. Well, in our previous signpost, we reflected on a few stories from my Camino walks, loosely around the theme of guidance. And we noted that it's essential to use the guidebook we've been given in the Bible, that we need to trust the last arrow, and when we get lost, we must retrace our steps back to the right path. Today, I want to explore just 3 more lessons from my Camino experiences. The first thing I would say is that I learned that Jesus' kingdom endures. You meet all kinds of people from all around the world on the Camino, and most of the time it's a very positive experience. I've met some lovely people on the Camino, and some of us have kept in touch and met up a few times since. Of course, meeting people on the Camino is not always a positive experience. Some people just aren't friendly, some are rude, and others are epic snorers. In 2018, my friend Ken and I got a cafe owner to drive us ahead a stage so that we could get away from 2 elderly and very loud snorers. But that's another story for another day. However, there's one group of people that you encounter on the Camino that you just can't get away from: the Romans. Many of the Camino paths follow old Roman roads. You can be walking in the middle of nowhere and then suddenly you find yourself walking on Roman paving stones. And many of the bridges that they built are still in use today, including the Great Bridge at Merida, almost a kilometre long. The Museo Romano in Merida has one of the best collections of Roman mosaics outside of Rome, and the city also boasts a Roman amphitheatre and various temples. Although the Romans are long gone, their fingerprints are everywhere in Spain, especially on the Caminos. The main Roman route to Spain was actually by boat to Cadiz, and then up the river to Sevilla, and then on the road north. I love history, and so I was always glad to come across another bit of Rome on the Camino. One day I walked over a bridge in the middle of nowhere and I noticed some carving in Latin on the rock face nearby, and rough translation, it basically said, "Hi, my name's Bob. I'm the engineer who built this bridge to the glory of the emperor on such and such a date." A long and difficult stage in the Camino goes from Carcaboso to Aldeanueva del Camino for about 38 kilometres. It's a long walk with very few options for accommodation to break up the stage. Roughly halfway, there's a reminder that the Camino path is indeed an old Roman road, for the Camino goes straight through the central arch of what was once the great Roman city of Caparra. It's not close to any major towns or cities today, but in Roman times it was a large and important city on the road north, and there's even a visitor centre now to tell its story. The Roman arch at Caparra is the unofficial symbol of the Via della Plata. It's carved on many of the official way markers. It's also a good place to have a break, to sit in the shade and have some water and food. And I remember sitting underneath the arch wondering if Paul ever made it to Spain and if he had walked under that arch. The site at Caparra is large, but like all Roman sites, it's just ruins. The arch hints at the glory and splendour that it once was, but now it's just a pile of stones on the ground. And as I surveyed the ruins of Caparra, I couldn't help but think of the famous quote from Shelley, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Every ruler of every empire thinks that theirs is the greatest empire in history, that they are the greatest ruler, and that their works will endure forever. I wondered what Paul would have said if he had been there when Caparra was in all its glory and splendour, and I kind of felt like I immediately knew the answer. He would have said that empires rise and fall, but there is one kingdom that will outlast them all, for it's an eternal kingdom, and it will last because it has an eternal king, Jesus. History is littered with the bones of those who have tried to destroy Christianity. And the reason that so many church buildings are built on top of old Roman, Viking, and Saxon places of worship is that it was a visible illustration to the people of the triumph of Christ over the false gods of paganism. And, as we look around the world today and see what's happening on our news screens, climate disasters, war, terrorism, all kinds of things going on, it's quite overwhelming. And it feels like the forces of chaos have been loosed upon the world. And I'm sure that's exactly what people thought when Roman legions turned up on their borders. Rome was to be feared. It was undoubtedly one of the greatest and most long-lived empires the world has ever known. But now it's just a tourist attraction, a pile of rocks, a memory of what once was a long time ago. In the same way, there'll come a time when today's rulers will also be a distant memory, and all their works will turn to dust. There's only one true kingdom and only one true king, and if we trust him, we don't have to fear any pretenders to his throne. But we should also note that the eternal nature of Jesus' kingdom has implications for how we live now. A common kind of spiritual idea in the West is that we should try to live in the moment, to be fully present, to fully experience this moment. It's really just a trendy way of telling us to live for today. But both the Bible and history call us to live not for today, but for eternity. For it's only the things of eternity that will last. John Piper tells a story of reading an article about people who retired to Florida. It's a popular place for Americans to retire because apart from the occasional hurricane, the climate's good. And the journalist who wrote the article asked one couple what they intended to do with their lives in retirement in Florida. And they replied that they wanted to collect shells from the beach. And Piper's response to the article was to imagine that couple standing before the throne of God and God saying, "So, what did you do with your life?" He suggested that saying to God that we collected shells from the beach might not be the best answer. On the journey of faith, we are called to be a people who live in the present moment, but always with a future perspective. One day, everything that we own will turn to dust, along with every ruler in history and all their works. They will fade into the past, into dust. We're called to live in light of the truth that there is only one true king, and that his kingdom is the only one that will endure. But not only will it endure, but his rule and reign will increase until every knee bows and every tongue confesses that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Another thing I learned in the Camino is that the path is rarely straight or smooth. Some days walking a Camino is great. I remember walking one day for 6 hours, mostly through woodland, so there was lots of shade. And for the entire walk, the only sounds that I heard were the sounds of the birds singing, of water flowing in the streams, and the sound of my feet on the path. It was absolute bliss. When you look at a map, the various caminos appear to be quite straight, and sometimes they are. For example, on the Via della Plata, on the stage to Torremolinos, there's a section that runs in a dead straight line for 10 kilometres. And so, looking at a large map, you would think that the Camino goes in a fairly straight line north from Seville to the town of Grania, where it turns left and goes northwest to Santiago. Except that it doesn't. Zooming in on the map, you can see that each daily stage has multiple twists and turns, sometimes on flat, level ground where the going is easy, and at other times over very rough terrain where you have to take great care not to twist an ankle or worse. In fact, some stages feel more like rock climbing than walking. And there are a lot of hills and quite a few mountains to go over with the risks of falling. Occasionally you have to cross major road junctions or walk on the roads, and that can be very dangerous. The guidebook for the Camino Mozarabe advises pilgrims to skip a stage by bus or taxi because of tragic accidents involving pilgrims as the Camino goes through to accident black spots. You must also be able to walk for 7 hours or more on paths through remote and lonely areas with no villages or homes between your departure and arrival point. If you fell or took ill, you could be in real trouble very quickly. My last Camino took 66 days, carrying on average a 10-kilo pack, walking up to 40 kilometres a day, sometimes with little or no shade in 30 to 40 degree heat over varied terrain, some of it difficult, trying to cope with a language barrier, with dogs, eating the same food every day. It's not easy. In fact, it's a lot more difficult than it looks in the movies or those celebrity I'm on the Camino TV shows. When I arrived in Santiago, the pilgrim office staff realised that I'd walked from Almeria and they stood up and applauded, because it's hard. Difficult as it is, walking a Camino is a lot easier than walking in the way of Jesus. In the rush and excitement of coming to faith in Jesus and committing our lives to him, it's easy to forget that Jesus almost seemed to go out of his way to put people off from being his disciples. To walk in the way of Jesus is to walk in the way of the cross, the way of self-denial and self-giving sacrificial love for others. It's not easy. Like the Camino, the journey of faith is neither a straight nor a smooth path, and those who embark on it will find themselves in places that they would rather not be, and in situations they wouldn't choose for themselves. To follow Jesus is to accept the truth of 1 Corinthians 6:19-20. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you've received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honour God with your bodies. Paul is telling us here that faith is not an ideology or belief. It's an embodied reality. In John 14, Jesus says that those who love him obey his commands, and those who don't obey his commands don't love him. And that obedience is costly. But to follow Jesus is to obey him, and if we're not obeying, we're not following. Jesus always told would-be disciples to count the cost of discipleship. For as Bonhoeffer said, when Christ calls us, he bids us come and die. As a pastor, I can't help but worry that churches today are so desperate for new converts that we make it too easy. We don't tell them how hard it's going to be to follow Jesus. We don't tell them it means no longer living to please ourselves, but to please God. And that being a Christian might mean giving things up, including our rights. It might mean losing friends or alienating family. Tim Keller has suggested that our churches are now filled with people who come for an emotional or spiritual high on a Sunday. They come because they want to feel good, to feel like they've had a spiritual experience, an intimate connection with God. But they don't want the hardship of surrender and sacrifice, of getting their lives in line with God's will. Yet Jesus says we're his friends if we obey his commands. And so what that means is that we can't have an intimate friendship with God without obedience. Bonhoeffer puts it bluntly when he says that only the believers obey and only the obedient believe. Jesus said no one can serve two masters. And so we're either living to obey the impulses of our own desires, or we are living to obey Jesus' commands. But we can't be doing both at the same time. And I wonder if that's a reason why many new converts don't continue in the faith. They imagined that following Jesus was going to lead from one joyful, ecstatic, spiritual mountaintop experience to the next, only to find that Jesus leads all his followers on the same twisting, uneven path that he walked, the path of surrender, self-giving, sacrificial love. And that's another thing I learned on the Camino. If you want a mountaintop experience, you have to climb the mountain. The town of Mochlin on the Camino Mozarabe is at the top of one of the steepest mountain paths on the Camino. Why they built a town there, I'll never know. But thanks to divine intervention, my friend Ken and I took a slightly easier route that wound its way around the mountain and up to the top. But it was still a difficult climb, and we were pretty knackered when we got there. When we got to the top, well, the views were amazing. Photographs don't do it justice, but I'll never forget how it felt to stand there. If you've been on the top of a mountain, you'll know what I mean. Walking in the way of Jesus has its fair share of mountaintop experiences. But we need to understand that they only come after the long, hard climb. As Bruce Cockburn sings, nothing worth having comes without some kind of fight. You have to kick at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. Spiritual growth comes from doing the hard work of reading and applying the Bible to our everyday lives. Seeking God in prayer, being part of a fellowship, serving others, giving and forgiving. Learning to love people who are not very lovable, etc. Mountaintop experiences come from the hard work of offering our lives to God as a living sacrifice. They come from living for something greater than our own lives, the glory of God. Above all, they come from obeying Jesus' commands. And none of that is easy. It is certainly costly. But it does bring a deeper joy and a greater sense of satisfaction and fulfillment than living for ourselves. When Ken and I walked or climbed the mountain to Mochlin, it was at times very difficult, especially the higher up we got. At one point I went on ahead, losing sight of Ken behind me because I felt that if I stopped, I would never get started again. However, when we got to the top and saw the views, in that moment we forgot all about the difficulty of the climb. In fact, we now look back on that day and say it was the best day of the entire Camino trip. I'm convinced of this. When we get to glory and see Jesus face to face, in that moment, the memory of all the difficulties and hardships, the suffering and the sorrows that we endured along the way will fade from our minds as if they had never existed. For in that moment, all the longings of our hearts will be fully met in Jesus. And in him, every promise of God will be fulfilled. It's worth the climb. Thanks for listening.